DW Inside Europe.
Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Sini in Germany. On today's programme, are Zelensky's conditions for peace in Ukraine at odds with the realities of the war? Ordinary men, horrific crimes. Could France's mass rape trial be a catalyst for change?
More politicians should seize this moment to talk about chemical submission, and there should be systematic training modules for the police and doctors.
And why Norway's electric vehicle revolution is in top gear.
I don't think anyone could picture this development that we've been through. In 2012, 3% of new cars were full electric cars. August this year, we are at above 94%.
Не втомлюються говорити «Слава Україні». Україна не втомлюється відповідати «Героям слава».
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed Parliament in Kyiv on Wednesday to unveil his long-awaited victory plan to end the war with Russia. Zelenskyy said the conflict could be over no later than next year, but he conceded that the implementation and success of his five-point plan depends on support from Ukraine's allies. I asked our Kyiv correspondent Nick Connolly for his assessment of Zelensky's 5 key points.
So I think to start off with, it's important to stress that we have received the public part of this, but there are still lots of things which are secret and which we haven't heard about, which are potentially the most interesting parts of this plan. So that's the caveat to start with. In terms of what we got from him in Parliament yesterday, it was a mixed bag. There were things we were expecting, like a renewed push to get a firm invitation to join NATO, talk of long-range weapons from the West to attack not just Russian troops in Ukraine, but also Russian targets inside Russia, far away from the front lines and the borders of Russia. But then there were also a few curveballs. So he was talking about, after the war, potentially Ukraine being able to contribute to European security, maybe even sending Ukrainian troops to defend other parts of Europe from Russia. Also talk of the need for a non-nuclear deterrent in Ukraine, so basically implying that Western countries should send their defense capabilities to Ukrainian soil to protect from a renewed Russian attack, whether that would be after NATO membership, before, all not clear. So it was kind of a mixed bag and lots of new things. And I think there'll probably be some raised eyebrows in the West, given quite how broad and wide-ranging this was.
I mean, even as Zelenskyy was addressing Parliament, news was coming through that Russian troops had captured 2 more villages in eastern Ukraine. And after Zelenskyy finished his speech, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov commented that Ukraine needed to, quote, sober up. Now, Zelensky's not prepared to make concessions, it seems, but do you think his demands are increasingly at odds with reality?
Look, I think the Russian spokespeople are going to say that kind of thing, whatever he does. As for, being unrealistic, I think there's been a dynamic all through this war where Zelenskyy has to ask for everything to get something, right? If you just think back to the beginning of this war, who would have thought that Ukraine would be getting F-16 fighter jets when even anti-tank weapons, let alone tanks, were thought to be totally beyond the pale? Who would have thought that Ukraine would have marched into Russian territory and held on to Russian territory for more than 2 months? That would have been absolutely unthinkable. So I think there is a part here where even if Zelenskyy doesn't necessarily think he'll get all the things he's asking for, he's trying to widen the scope and widen the kind of frame of reference. So I wouldn't necessarily say that he believes he's going to get everything or he doesn't see the difficulties involved. He's just refusing to kind of go by the kind of very conservative kind of roadmap that maybe most of the kind of political classes in Europe and America are expecting him to take.
Well, I mean, for more than 2.5 years now, Ukraine's allies have repeatedly and very forcefully stressed their support for Kyiv, but it's clear that war fatigue has set in. And of course, Zelenskyy must be concerned about the future of Western support, especially with the uncertain outcome of the US elections next month.
I think certainly he's aware of that. He sees that. But I think there's also a feeling here in Kyiv that as much as maybe Western capitals would want this war to be over in a hurry so they can get back to thinking about domestic issues or the Middle East, they do not want to see Ukraine collapse and Vladimir Putin pick up a big win here. So there is a question of, being an uncomfortable ally. Look, people in Ukraine see Israel. They see Israel receiving lots of weapons and ignoring American advice. and you have increasing voices here saying, do the same. This is not Ukraine's job to make life easy for Western politicians. Ukraine here is fighting for its independence, its sovereignty. And they say, look, we basically did what we were told in 2014. We froze the conflict. We joined a kind of negotiating process in Minsk that was clear from a Ukrainian perspective, clearly not going to go anywhere. And basically that just allowed Vladimir Putin time to rebuild his army and then to attack once again in 2022. So there's a real reluctance there to basically do the convenient thing for the outside world. And there's also a feeling that when push comes to shove, even if, Paris, London, Berlin and DC would want this to wind down, they're not going to allow Ukraine, they're not going to deprive Ukraine of the support to allow then Putin to make huge gains on the battlefield.
And what about ordinary Ukrainians? Do you have a sense that they're prepared to keep going, or are more and more now perhaps thinking that, maybe it's worth making concessions to simply stop the killing and the destruction? I
think it's, in terms of public opinion and when you speak to people, I think the real distinction is if we get NATO membership or NATO and even a clear invitation, if we get some kind of bilateral security guarantees from the US, as Japan has, or South Korea, for instance, then Ukrainians would be willing to think about basically freezing the conflict and staying along the current front lines. Then there would be clarity that, okay, the Ukrainian government controls these territories and that is it. NATO or America is not going to help Ukraine to regain what it's already lost, but the kind of continuing encroachment of Russian boots on the ground on Ukraine territory would be stopped. But if there's no such guarantee, if there's just some kind of vague promise to send some weapons, potentially if more happens, then many Ukrainians are going to be very reluctant because they say that, right now the West is forced to engage with this topic. It has its attention on this. But if this, if hostilities are wound down for a couple of years, then the political attention will go. And next time around, maybe Vladimir Putin will be more successful. And I was speaking there to DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. For weeks, the horrific details emerging from a trial in the southern French city of Avignon have attracted global attention. 71-year-old Dominique Pellicot has admitted drugging his wife till she was unconscious, raping her, organising more than 50 other men to rape her and filming the abuse over a period of 9 years. The court case has put a spotlight on so-called chemical submission, in other words, rape using drugs. And the victim, Gisèle Pellicot, is inspiring others with her dignity and courage. Our correspondent Lisa Louis has this report.
This is how Gisèle Pellicot is welcomed at the courthouse in southern Avignon at the start of every new day of trial. Dozens of women gather to applaud her courage and grace. Also, as Pellicot has waived her right to anonymity and insisted on an open court, which is exceptional in a rape case. And so 49-year-old Justine has been able to follow the trial each day from Paris. Justine says a female acquaintance drugged her and forced her into having sex with her and a man in late 2021. She says the woman filmed the abuse and asked for 20,000 euros to delete the videos. When Justine didn't pay up, the woman sent the videos to some of her friends and neighbours. Justine still doesn't feel safe enough to speak out under her real name. But watching Pellicot has given her new hope.
Gisèle is a shining light that's exposing a dark side of society which some are trying to hide. We need to follow her lead. She stands for the power of speaking out.
Justine's lawyer filed rape charges after the police had refused to do so. But her court case hasn't made any progress.
I'm absolutely devastated by what's happened to me. I have to live with this abuse every day. I go to bed with it and nightmares about it wake me up. But Gisèle has given me the courage to return to the court where they told me my case was on hold. I will not give up until they pick it up again.
Another woman, 63-year-old Anne, who was drugged and raped as a child by her father, who also filmed the abuse, is convinced the Pellicot case will inspire many in France and abroad. Anne can't use her real name for legal reasons, even though her case happened in the 1970s and falls under the statute of limitations. In France, rape cases can at the latest be brought to justice 20 years after they occurred.
This is an XXL Me Too movement. Giselle shows such dignity and elegance, and she's not tarnished by all the harm and abuse that she suffered, which is being exposed in court. She's become a role model for many survivors of rape who, like myself in the past, feel ashamed to talk about the abuse they suffered as if it were their own fault.
Anne thinks the trial is also highlighting that so-called chemical submission, rape after being drugged, doesn't only take place at parties and in nightclubs.
Chemical submission also happens in families, and often over several years, although it's obviously very difficult to detect.
Dominique Pellicourt's crimes only came to light by coincidence when the police investigated him for voyeurism in another case and then found the videos of the abuse on his hard drive. Outwardly, Pellicourt seemed like an average family man.
Véronique Le Goaziou, je suis sociologue.
Véronique Le Goaziou says that's often the case with rapists. She's a sociologist and research fellow specialising in sexual abuse at French public research institution CNRS. She calls this the banality of evil, a term first coined by German philosopher Hannah Arendt in 1963 for a book on Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organisers of the Holocaust.
Rapists are often people from all walks of life, who work, have children and a normal life. What's more, Giselle Pellicourt is a woman who was unknown to the public and is asking for justice. She can't be dismissed as some hysterical feminist, and that gives her struggle even more force.
Meanwhile, Jean-Michel Aubry-Journet, a Paris-based music producer, wants to do his bit to give that struggle additional strength.
Je pense que dès qu'on demande à un homme d'être humble,
Together with 200 other men, he signed an op-ed asking for an end to the system of male domination.
la remise en question masculine, elle est
All men need to call out our friends and family when they show unacceptable behavior. Otherwise, we are complicit in their abuse.
That's an attitude some lawyers should learn from, thinks Arnaud Gallet.
M'endors pas, stop soumission chimique. Ce mouvement vise à alerter pour informer...
He's the founder, together with Giselle Pellicourt's daughter Caroline Darian, of the help group M'endors pas, or Don't Put Me to Sleep.
Giselle is being subjected to what the European Court of Human Rights has called secondary victimization. Certain defense lawyers are causing her additional trauma by saying things like she gave her consent, while she was unconscious or even snoring.
His group has filed a formal complaint with the chairman of the Lawyers Association and intends to, if necessary, take the procedure to the EU level to establish stricter rules for French lawyers. And Gala is hoping for change on another level.
More
politicians should seize this moment to talk about chemical submission, and there should be systematic training modules for the police and doctors.
Khada Khatem agrees there should be nationwide specific training programs.
Caroline, la fille de la victime, était venue me voir.
The gynecologist is the head of the medical centre Maison des Femmes in Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. It's one of the few establishments organising day-long workshops on chemical submission.
Ce qui m'avait intéressée en tant que soignant, c'est l'errance diagnostique, en fait.
There are just too many diagnostic errors. When a patient tells a doctor that they keep having memory lapses, medical personnel should immediately consider that this could be a case of chemical submission.
But Jean-Christophe Couvy, National Secretary at Police Union Unité, says such specific training modules are rarely available for the police.
Courses on sexual violence form part of our basic training, but only a few specialised police officers get access to classes on chemical submission. These classes should be accessible to all of us, also so that we're up to date as to which drugs are being used.
Justine, a trained psychologist, has in the meantime found her own way of keeping her head above water.
J'ai pu bénéficier de quelques séances d'hypnose et de MDR.
I realized that hypnosis and EMDR trauma therapy were helping me a lot, and so I learned how to give such therapy sessions to my patients, many of whom have been sexually abused. By helping them heal, I'm healing myself.
The government has now agreed to revive a parliamentary commission on chemical submission, which could initiate a shift in the law and finally gather some official figures on rape using drugs. Anne is hoping that this could lead to an end of the statute of limitations in cases of sexual abuse, especially when it comes to minors, so that even decades later, abusers like her father, who is still alive, can be held to account. Lisa Louis, DW, France.
And for updates on the Pellicourt trial and other news here in Europe, head to our website dw.com. I'm Helen Seeney in Germany, and you're listening to Inside Europe.
European politics. It's complicated, right?
Luckily, there's a podcast that helps make sense of it.
It's called The Europeans.
Every week, we break down the biggest stories in European politics.
Can I disagree slightly with the premise of your question?
Go for it.
I think some European leaders may actually prefer Donald Trump.
And some quirky non-political stories you probably missed.
Vilnius, the G-spot of Europe. Nobody knows where it is, but once you find it, it's amazing.
The Europeans.
New episodes every Thursday.
Norway looks set to become the first country in the world to only sell fully electric private cars. EVs already make up nearly 95% of the market, and a self-imposed 2025 deadline to reach 100% looks likely to be met. In comparison, EV sales in much of the rest of Europe has been sluggish, and here in Germany it's even fallen. So, how did the Norwegians do it? Our very own Lars Bavanger has more from Oslo.
I'm hitching a ride with Ellen Setov and Espen Wang Andreasen on their daily commute into Oslo.
Kaffe til deg, hvis du vil ha.
I did this exact same journey with them over 10 years ago, when few people drove EVs. Being early adopters, Ellen and Espen had bought a Nissan Leaf, one of the very first family-sized EVs. Now they drive a German, roomy, upmarket SUV, and they no longer stand out from other Norwegian car owners.
There's absolutely nothing special with having an EV in Norway right now. On the contrary, it's the norm, actually.
When I started using the electric car, I could always park in Oslo with a free charging. The parking spaces for the electric cars were always available, whereas now you can't find parking places for electric cars. And if you find them, they're like really expensive or not available. So there's a big change.
Now, there's one difference I notice right now. We're driving on our way into Oslo in the morning rush hour. Last time, we were in the bus lane, but no more.
It sort of felt like a superpower because you were just passing the queue. Now they have closed the commuter lanes.
Incentives like tax breaks, free parking and the use of bus lanes have been cut back as the carpool is turning fully electric. Some owners missed incentives, but it seems that a critical mass has been reached, meaning nearly no one buys a new fossil fuel car anymore.
I don't think anyone could picture this development that we've been through. In 2012, 3% of new cars were full electric cars. August this year, we are at above 94%.
Christina Bu is the Secretary General of the Norwegian EV Association. And yes, it is the largest EV association in the world.
With good policies and a clear goal, people change perspective. They often come up to me and say, I used to say I would never get an electric car, but now I drive and then they tell me what EV they drive, and they see the world differently.
So what have been the main drivers to make people swap from fossil fuel cars to electric cars?
It's definitely not that Norwegians are more environmentally friendly than Germans, for example. It's absolutely about incentives and tax exemptions, but just as important, has been that we have gradually increased the taxes on petrol and diesel engine cars. So these cars have sort of gradually been taxed out of business in Norway.
Christina Bu believes other countries in Europe could learn from Norway. EV sales have increased in most countries, but far slower than here. In Germany, EV sales in the first half of 2024 fell by over 16% when purchase incentives were removed. People here in Norway really started going fully electric when the technology started improving to offer long-range luxurious models that were, in fact, cheaper to buy than their petrol or diesel versions due to tax breaks. In other countries, it is perhaps not so simple, believes Erik Feigenbaum, Chief Research Engineer at the Norwegian Institute of Transport Economics.
Of course, Norway has been in the fortunate situation that we have had very high taxes on vehicles in general, which made it possible to have more room to play with the incentives. And we also have a large income from the oil sector, which we use to balance the national budget. So we don't have the same budget crunch that maybe other countries have, where if you give incentives to EVs, you have to do less of other good things that you want to do by the government want to do, whether it's better schools or whatever.
Norway's roads are not only used by private cars, of course. Vans and heavy-duty trucks are still mainly fossil-driven. But things are afoot also here. Ingvild Kielen Røholt works with the transport sector at the environmental organisation Zero Emissions in Oslo.
We're around 12% for trucks, which is quite good, but we need to get up on that as well. But then we don't have purchase tax on trucks, so we have to use like toll roads and incentives to help them go. And we also are now working to build out charging infrastructure for heavy-duty trucks. Buses, they are all electric in Oslo. What we're lagging behind is the vans, because we have lots of vans, but it's only like 30% of the purchase is electric vans. So we have a long way to go to get 100% of the vans also electric.
Electrifying the transport sector does have an impact on the environment. Here in Norway, CO2 emissions from transport fell by 7.8% between 2022 and 2023 alone. EU's goal to ban the sale of new fossil fuel cars is 10 years behind Norway's in 2035. That's too late for the environment, but also for Europe's car industry, argues Christina Bu at the Norwegian EV Association.
I think Europe as a whole need to have a strategy for, competing with the rest of the world and especially China. And if European car manufacturers are to survive in the future, we need to work together. But in addition, each country, I think, can do more to speed up this transition, because Norway has shown that it's possible to do this really quickly if you have strong enough policies.
Ellen and Espen still own their Nissan Leaf and use it as a runaround in town. But its reach is not up for longer trips. Their new car, however, seems to fulfill all their requirements. Would you ever consider going back to a fossil fuel car?
No, of course not. Not at all. And going on holiday in Europe with an EV, we have done that. A lot of people do that every summer, and if you do some slight planning, there's absolutely no problem at all.
Lars Prevanger, DW, Oslo.
Just a reminder that we're always keen to hear your feedback on the show. If you have any comments or queries, then drop us a line at insideeurope@dw.com. We'd love to hear from you. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Helen Sini in Germany.